Thank you for attending this webinar series. Today is the first of three parts on the reality of getting rid of the annual review. Today's session, David Cohen will deal with the most critical questions to be asked before retiring performance reviews. My name is Anthony Lachu, and I'm the Director of Business Development at ASL, Hire to Retire software since 1989. What I'd like to do is invite everyone to ask questions as we go through the webinar. A little bit about our presenter today. We're pleased to have Dr. David Cohen. David is a global thought leader in the design of integrated human resources processes. He is the author of several books, and he is a regular international keynote presenter at HR conferences, as well as conducting working sessions.
Hello?
So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Cohen. David?
Hi there, and welcome to this presentation. What I hope to do today is to share with you some of my own learnings that have come up from research that I've been doing with organizations on the whole process of performance management. I had written an article in 1996 that said if performance management was done right, there would be no need for an annual review, and it seems that finally the rest of the world has caught up with that concept and is trying to implement it. In this session today, what I'd like to do is share with you some of the issues that have come up around performance management and what have been some of the ways that organizations have tried to address it and what seems to be some of the questions that need to be asked. I have done two major workshops in New York City with the Conference Board of America on this topic recently, and the questions that need to be asked are not mine. They're actually coming from a broad-based set of participants who represent mostly Fortune 100 companies, and I would be glad to, you'll see at one point I'll ask you to send me your email addresses, and I will send you a complete list that about 100 different organizations have shared with me that say these are the things that need to be addressed, or these are the questions that need to be asked before beginning to make any changes to the performance management process. What I want to start off with is, what is your company's vision for performance management? In other words, has your company actually articulated a purpose for performance management? Because that will inform you as to what can and can't be done, or the purpose would have to be changed. Have traditional performance systems failed, and if so, why? And what does need to change? And what differentiates a performance conversation from coaching and dialogue? As coaching and dialogue seem to be, coaching and conversations seem to be the topic that most organizations seem to focus on. And I'll share with you my perspective on why they both failed and why dialogue is the way to go forward, based on what I've heard from organizations that have tried to eliminate the formal annual review. Why does, and what's the elephants in the room? There are two elephants in the room. If you're going to eliminate formal evaluation, what happens to compensation is one of the elephants in the room. I'll share with you the other one when we get to that section. And what are the actions you need, in conclusion, to consider before you begin this path and drop ratings? One of the big issues is, what is the purpose of ratings and how are they used? So just to quickly give you a sort of Dilbert cartoon, because every presentation needs at least one or two Dilbert cartoons. I have two of them. This is sort of, I got a text message from our boss. Keep up, WRK. What does that mean? And Dilbert says, you just got your annual performance review. What is your company's vision? So section one, what is your company's vision for performance management? On a higher philosophical level, therefore, what are the reasons that your organization conducts performance reviews? How often are planned formal reviews conducted? what happens with that information from the annual review. In other words, the question becomes, currently, what are you doing in performance management, and why are you doing it? Now, the big question I have is, how honest are your managers when conducting your formal reviews? In other words, I believe there's two sources of great fiction written at corporations. The first source of fiction comes from employees before they get hired, and that's in the resumes. And the second source of fiction is in the annual review. And the reason for those sources of fiction vary, but reality is most research shows that approximately 40 to 50% of what is written on resumes is an exaggeration of the truth at best to outright lies. And in performance reviews, how often have you heard the problem that, well, we have a bell curve, or I need to keep this person, so I'm going to give them a better review than they deserve so they can get a bonus or get a retention pay, but they don't really deserve it if I was telling them the truth. But I need to do it in order to just keep them happy and keep them retained, because I'm getting measured for retention, and that's the best way to keep them here. So some of the systems that we put in, that I'm trying to say, is, why do you do what you do, and what are the consequences for having those in place? What are they driving? And we're going to talk about three particular ones in a few seconds. Do you have a forced ranking, forced distribution? Many organizations are beginning to realize the peril of forced distribution. But I was just speaking this morning with a major oil company in the refinery section, and one of the bones of contention by middle management is the forced ranking system still, but they don't seem to give it up. Hopefully after our meeting next week, they might start considering it. Are positive or negative consequences part of the goal-setting process? The question is what is the purpose of your performance review? And if the performance review purpose is a change in an employee's behavior, and the basic premise for behavior change is consequences, and your performance review does not include, as most do not, consequences, both positive and negative, you're likely not to get any sort of movement in changing one's behavior. So do you include consequences in your performance reviews? And if not, why not? And if they are they meaningful enough to put a fire under somebody to change their behavior? And what are your employee engagement results? How well have the employees embraced performance management? Are you even thinking about employee engagement results associated with the level of performance management? To me, engagement is only one thing. It's discretionary effort. And if the performance management system isn't helping drive discretionary effort, then what is the purpose of performance management system? Is the system in a part of succession planning? Because if it is, you have to think of this, and it's just food for thought. The food for thought is simple. If performance reviews contain a great deal of fiction in them, and you're using the performance reviews as part of the succession planning process, it's basically garbage in, garbage out, because you're basing it on false information. So, and that's one point. The second point is the performance management system captures the person's performance in their current job, and most often their current job is not reflection of their future job that you're growing them to. So by having them in using information from the current performance review for identification of future leaders of the organization is often the wrong source of information. And I've often said, why does anybody look at performance reviews when they're identifying a high potential future leader for promotion, unless that review covers the exact same criteria needed for the role that they're moving into? And if it does, it's probably not a promotion. It's probably a lateral move. And without vision, therefore, there's no direction. And without direction, you don't know if you're moving in the right direction. So in order for your performance management process to work, it needs to have a purpose. It needs to have direction. Because if you know the purpose, you can then begin, I hope, to fulfill some of the needs. Now, one of the first questions that will come up, one of the first things that the research has shown is I do not believe in benchmarking, because benchmarking means that you can replicate it, and since no two organizations have the same culture, the same values, the same behaviors around that culture and values, no two organizations have the same leadership style or behaviors. I do not believe benchmarking is going to work. However, there are common practices that seem to be able to be reflection of what's going on and how to move forward. One of the common practices that organizations have had to successfully set up this movement towards an elimination of ranking, rating, and the annual review is to, first and foremost, conduct with employees who receive reviews, what do they think of the current process, because there might be something in there they actually like. And by eliminating that unknowingly, you're taking away their comfort level. Number two, you need to do the same thing with people who give the reviews. And the third thing is, which is going to come up later in what needs to be in place in order to make this process successful, and this is the big challenge, is your CEO, is your president, or members of the executive team held accountable to conduct the review the same way they're expecting others in the organization? Are they using the same words? Are they using the same format? Are they using the same process as others? Because if they're not, people are always looking up to see what's flowing down. And if my boss doesn't do it, therefore, why should I begin to waste the time to do it? Because they're not paying attention to it. So what have been over the decades, and performance management, by the way, I always joke that the first performance review was probably given when Adam ate the apple, or whatever it is, and gave feedback to Eve on what did you just do, or what did I just do. And performance reviews have been happening for decades. In the Middle Ages, in guild associations and apprenticeships, you were an apprentice getting feedback every day. In fact, this whole movement towards the elimination of the annual review is nothing more than, I'd say, a back to the future exercise of what was happening during the Middle Ages when somebody was apprenticing in a guild to become a future whatever they might be, typesetter, cobbler, whatever. Probably they were getting feedback at the end of every experience, every project, every day, and had a choice of either improving or finding somebody else to work for. So I don't think that what we're talking about is something that's really new. I think what we're talking about is something which is more practical than what has happened in the past. But drive organizational performance. So one of the criteria I think you have to look at is where is the link? What is the anecdotal as well as the hard factual evidence that our process of performance management has actually driven organizational performance? Second question you have to ask, is there clear alignment between individual and organizational performance? In other words, do I, the individual contributor, understand that my work is contributing to the success of the organization? How does it motivate employees to perform better? Is it in fact generating discretionary effort? Or is it being used as a carrot and stick or a punishment process? Engage employees in the wider vision, values, and goals of the organization. Is your performance review process actually include the values of the organization? Does it, based on that, if you accomplish this goal, this activity, you will in fact contribute to something larger than yourself? Because human nature, as I understand it, is we all like to do something that goes beyond ourselves in order to feel we're contributing. Does it enable the company to identify and develop, therefore, high potentials and high performers, people who are different than your average performer? Does it enable development discussions and improve employee competency? And competency is not skill and knowledge alone. Competency is the ability to demonstrate the behaviors associated with the job, specific to the job, and demonstrate and live the behaviors that articulate the values. So competency is really a combination of all four. Enable the company to identify and manage low performers. Because low performers, there's different reasons that people are low performers, and it might be an easy fix. And as we know from a pure mathematical equation, it's easier to get somebody who's a low performer to become a high performer than it is to hire somebody new from the outside. And provide focus and clarity for employees in their jobs. Does the performance review process continuously improve my understanding of what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and how I'm doing it? Too often it focuses on the what I'm doing and the results and never understands the why. And if we don't understand the why, we just go through the motions. Now, there are three traditional performance management activities that I have found through discussing this with people around the world have caused issues with performance management. I want to go through each of these fairly quickly, but I want to give you some information that really focuses on why are these issues. Now, in one global survey that Mercer put out 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago actually, their global survey indicated that only 3% reported back that they were getting exceptional value out of performance management. Now, if the organization put in a new machine, or if they put in a new process for sales or a new web system for their internet or intranet, and they weren't getting exceptional value out of it, they would probably sell it off and change it real quick and make sure they drove value out of it. If they were looking at something that needs work at 50%, they probably fire the person who put it in place, and worked well at 50% just isn't going to cut it. But yet we seem to accept that with performance management as it exists today. Another more recent survey from SHRM basically indicated that more than 80% of appraisal systems are not successful, and only 5% of HR professionals are very satisfied with their performance management systems. So whether it is the study that was put out by Mercer, the study by other organizations, by SHRM and others, the general rule of thumb is the performance management system as we know it today is just not working. So why do we keep hitting our head against the wall, as Einstein was quoted as saying, and expecting different results? It baffles the mind. So let's look at the three concepts that are usually, have always been, have in many cases, been part of the annual review. And these are the questions that you got to ask yourself. Why do we use them? And how is our organization responding to them? And are we gaining value out of it? Because as I said, if we have a new piece of machinery in the factory that's not adding value and we realize it's not adding value, we'd stop it right away. But yet these three have actually destroyed value, have lowered morale, have caused people to behave incorrectly in many cases, and yet we keep putting them in place, and I'm baffled by why that's happening. So let's look at the bell curve. Now, the bell curve is a long-standing belief that was put out there by GE that said that we should have forced distribution and that we should, in fact, cut out those people who are in the bottom percentile because they're not adding value to the organization. We should only recognize those finite few that are in the higher percentage, and everybody is average. As a result of that, we've identified what we consider outstanding performers in Deadwood, with the vast majority of people being average. But if I know some of the things that have resulted from that have been mediocre work, and I'll share with you some of the other things, but Dick Rote, who actually put forward this whole concept many years ago on force ranking, noted that abandoning something unpopular is not necessarily right. I would say it's not only unpopular, but it actually doesn't drive people's performance. And it, in fact, drives negative performance and is an issue associated with retention of good employees. Because what we know from the bell curve research is the impact of force ranking has top performers who are continuously not ranked as top performers leave out of fear that they're just not going to go anywhere. They've been hit a ceiling that for whatever reasons they're not going to break through. It is proven to be an obstacle to teamwork, yet every organization, when they put a competency model together, wants to have teamwork in there, but yet then they put a process in place that says, oh, we're going to force you to hoard information so you're better than the guy next to you, so you in fact are therefore able to get a better ranking. And what if more than 10 to 15% of performers are above average? And this is what I hear all the time from good managers. I've actually worked with my people. I've got everybody to be successful. Everybody has met their expectations. People are sincerely improving. And now I got to force rank them and distribute them, and now I feel bad. While on the other hand, those people that are on the bottom end of the average group or on the bottom feel they're losers. And as we know from our days in school, when we start to label children as well as adults as some are successful and some are not, there seems to be a stigma of, and it goes back to teamwork, why should I work with David if in fact he is considered one of the losers in the group or just average? I just want to work with the above average people. But yet it does cause, when you think about it, and all is said and done, the dust settles, what it causes is average performance. So if we're looking to improve performance, the bell curve just hasn't cut it. What else it has? Incentives to develop and grow are reduced. Compensation is ineffectively distributed because the people that should be compensated, those who are truly high potential but yet not cutting it, those who have opportunity for development, those who have been put on special projects to learn something new and given an opportunity to learn and fail. Failure is not an option, and so therefore it creates a sort of anxiety in people. Mid-level performers are not highly motivated as a result. The managers who improve people's performance are, as I said before, between a rock and a hard place. Which gets me to one of my favorite topics, multi-source assessment or 360 feedback. Reality is that 360 feedback has one purpose and one purpose only. That's to help people develop. Now let me just share with you a story that came out of work that I did with Air Canada technical operations many years ago, a number of years ago, about 10 years ago or so. Working with the top 400 people or the 400 managers in technical operations. We put together a profile that was called two profiles. One was a team leader and one was team participant. All the team leaders were given feedback and the team participants were providing the feedback. Now here's an interesting point. The team participants were mostly union members. But because we included the union members in the decision-making process on how the profile was created and the usage of 360 feedback was to improve people's ability to manage them successfully, the way they wanted to be managed, they were fully open to the idea of providing feedback. Not only open to the idea, but also some of it, Air Canada at the time, had created a joint alliance with the union that every manager in the organization had a union counterpart and decision-making was a joint process. In fact, after the first round of feedback, the union asked, why are their partners not getting feedback so their partners can improve? The focus of this was solely for the purpose of individual performance improvement. We had a discussion with them on using it for performance management, and some of the research I showed with them showed when it's used for performance management and it's used for succession planning, people invariably corrupt the data. What does that mean? They inflate people's scores because they don't want to hurt them. Or on the other hand, with succession planning, it's a great way to inflate the scores. If you know it's for succession planning and the manager you have is not a manager you want, the best way to get rid of that manager is give them really great scores. And Robin Winsickle, who was the head of technical operations at the time, gave me a call after the corporation put in a separate process of 360 feedback for succession planning, and his comment was that it proved my point. People who in our process were getting clear messages that there were areas they had to improve performance on. In the 360 for succession planning, we're getting messages that they were identified as high potential when in reality they weren't even high performers, because people had used that opportunity to give them better than deserved feedback. It reinforced for me very strongly that 360 feedback, when it's used for performance reviews, when it's used for succession planning, are areas where you get feedback that is about as fictitious as the feedback that are on your annual performance reviews. So 360 feedback provides, when feedback providers know the boss and others will see the feedback, it's not reliable. In other words, if I am going to do 360 feedback and I know that the boss of this person I'm giving it to will see it, I therefore will change my perspective on how I want that feedback to be given, because as a friend of mine, if I told them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear, it means their boss will also see them, and I know their boss kind of likes them, but why should I therefore change the boss's opinion because they are a friend of mine? And I'll just keep it a secret that they need to improve that performance. And as a result of that, we often find that you get skewed higher. Now, people will say it's not true because, after all, we're using 360 and we're getting all these results and people are putting together development plans. But I'm saying, do you have a measure against having done the 360 for the same people where the results were kept in the person's domain, where the person selected the 360 feedback providers that were optional, where the person was the only person who saw the 360, and the only thing that really matters out of 360 is not the results, but the action that comes out of it. So 360 feedback, when it's used, should be used for development only. It should be used based on the premise that the criteria are relevant to the organization. It should be used in such a way that there are no numbers about outside information. In other words, by putting down, we've done this with 500,000 people around the world. This is the mean score, the average score. That's a behavior that person must work on for their own work, but they're above average. They see that score and they say, hey, I'm above average. Why should I work on it? When in fact, that's the one behavior that might change their ability to get higher performance. Or they see a behavior that is really not relevant to their performance, and they are way below the mean or the average score, and they say, I'm going to work on that because I got to raise it. And in fact, that score is not relevant to their performance. So there's a lot of ways that 360 are organized. I can probably go into a full webinar or two on 360 feedback and give you a lot of the pros and cons of what goes on to 360, but to keep it focused is two things. Don't use it for as part of performance management, and never have people develop on more than 2 behaviors out of that entire list, and make sure the behaviors that they're working on are relevant to the behaviors necessary to be demonstrated more frequently in order to be successful. But 360 feedback gives a lot of misinformation in performance reviews, but yet we rely on it as part of the information. Now, here's a question that you got to ask for yourself. Do people work for money? Most people will say yes, they work for money. But I say money is nothing more than a hygiene factor. When I decided to work for your organization, I also applied for 2 or 3 other jobs. I knew that within probably 10 to 15%, the salaries were all the same. And for whatever reason, I chose your organization. At that point, money is off the table. Money is no longer something I'm considering. I now consider the way that I'm treated, and is the work that I'm doing meaningful, And is the organization aligned with my values? So there's a false understanding. I know compensation people don't like hearing this because they're afraid it diminishes their role, their high visibility, their high importance in the organization. It's not true because they have a lot of work that yet needs to be done. So how did this start? It started because people, when money is involved, it becomes a right. In other words, money becomes an obligation. So once I start giving bonus, once I start giving merit, once I start giving annual increases, I can't take it away. Another large bank that I worked with many years ago, the CEO came in and wanted to save money. He had to cut the budget significantly, realized that the annual Christmas party in Toronto was held at the Sky Dome over 3 days or 4 days, and it cost $250,000. He decided to cut it because, after all, it was a bonus. It wasn't something that was innate to the organization. He cut it and started getting letters from people who were currently employees that because they came as children to the Christmas party, they worked there when they came with their grandparents, and that cutting it was like taking away a basic right of being part of the organization. It was reinstated. So you got to think about what is the purpose in your organization for compensation, and how are we using compensation when the carrot and stick mentality of piecemeal work during the Industrial Revolution was the source of compensation and the source of, if you produce so many widgets per hour, you'll get so much extra money. With a white-collar worker, those days are gone. And pay for performance, therefore, is a myth. People do not work for money. And the best way for me to explain that is to share with you, the idea that we all belong to volunteer organizations, not-for-profit organizations. And in joining those organizations, what we do is we give our own discretionary income. But yet many people, when they think about it, would rather go to work at their volunteer organization than go to work, even though they're not going to get paid for it, because it's something meaningful to them. So if the performance review is not giving you a sense of the work that I do is meaningful, the way that people are treated in the organization or the way that I want to be treated, and that I'm being treated that way and there are no surprises, then compensation really doesn't matter. It becomes an excuse to leave the organization because in an exit interview, nobody's going to argue with me. Even though I'm going to a job, I'll give you an example. My own son, he was working after his MBA in finance for some major organizations in finance, and he went to work every day and he hated it. Recently, about 2 years ago, he joined an organization at the University of Toronto at the Rotman School that gives microfinancing to people who are coming back in, entrepreneurs that are coming out of treatment for mental health issues. And he helps them build a business plan. He helps them put together a presentation for funding of between $2,500 to $25,000, and he's loving it at 50% of what he got from his last company. But he wouldn't give that job up for a 100% increase. So you got to really think, is what's the myth? Pay is therefore what I call a hygiene factor. And what do people really work for? Well, let's take a look at millennials, for instance. I mean, there's this myth around millennials are going to jump jobs and they're not loyal, they're not staying with us. So I'm going to ask you a question. How many millennials, people under 33, have been working at your organization for more than 3 years? And I guarantee you there are quite a few. And you got to ask yourself why. Because none of them fit the paradigm that the press puts out there and consultants put out there. And they're probably working for you because of a number of reasons. They believe that corporate social responsibility is happening in your organization the way they want it to happen. They're aligned with the values and the behaviors, beliefs of the organization, and they see opportunity to learn and grow, not get promoted. They do not want to be managers, usually. And once they see that, they say, hey, this is a good place to work, and they don't leave. And in fact, when I did research this past summer with a number of interns who were 20, 21 years of age, many of them said that they are looking for a job that they can stay at for many years. They don't want to, be a journeyman or a journey person. They want to, in fact, find a place where they feel comfortable and aligned to the purpose of the organization, the values of the organization, and the organization is giving back. And they'll stay there a long time. If you need any more proof of this, or if you want any anecdotal evidence to performance is one of the issues that has to be addressed, and you haven't read Daniel Pink's book, Drive, I highly recommend that you read it. So what are some of the other issues? Some of the other issues, and this is one I love the most, is we ask our employees to do self-evaluation. And self-evaluations are usually never accurate. Self-evaluations are how we see ourselves, and by the way, they're for our performance review, and therefore we want to make sure we get that bonus, we get that compensation, we get that recognition, and therefore unless something is blatantly obvious, our self-evaluations are usually an exaggeration to some degree of the truth. In addition to that, it makes managers lazy because they don't really have to do their job. They just take that self-evaluation, change a few words, modify it, and say, okay, sign it, I'll sign it, let's get on with life. We also confuse the matter when we have career aspiration discussions during performance management. If I'm focused on helping you improve, why am I talking about your career aspirations at the same time? Because what you need for your career aspirations might not be what you need to be successful on this job. Another question is, what if I have no career aspirations? I absolutely love my job. I had a client once that was very upset that one of their high potential, what they thought was a high potential young female in the organization, had passed over a promotion assignment 3 times. And why didn't she have any aspirations? And when I was talking in a focus group she attended, she made it quite clear. If they ask her to move again, she's going to quit. Because currently, her aspiration was to get home at 5 o'clock and be with her young children, and that she had no aspirations for a change in her job because a change in her job wouldn't fit her lifestyle. But nobody in the organization ever took time to ask her, does she have aspirations for other jobs? They were just imposing that on her, and she was offended by it. Are the goals set at the start of the year modified during the year, but at the end of the year, we go back to the old goals to review them? It's a question that you have to understand a lot of organizations still have a problem with. And items are brought up in the discussion that are not based on the complete, not based on the last, or based on the last complaint about the employee. In other words, because managers rarely are present when their employees do their work, they rely on other people for feedback on the person, and usually we only get feedback when there's a complaint to be had. So those are some of the things that, from a philosophical point of view and a practical point of view, are some of the 3 most common elements that go into performance reviews that I find if you're moving away from the annual review, but you're keeping in compensation issues, you're keeping in issues of forced feedback, of 360 feedback that is shared beyond the individual, and if you're keeping in there the whole idea of force ranking, moving away from a traditional formal annual review and an annual rating system is going to be a very difficult journey, if not impossible. So those are 3 things that have to be evaluated. And is your senior management team, is your board of directors willing to give those 3 things up? Because if they're not willing to give them up, it's going to be very difficult to create a performance, an annual review system, or eliminate an annual formal review. So what differentiates performance, conversations, coaching, and dialogue? And this is my own personal perspective. And there's a quote I recently read on LinkedIn from Socrates that I really feel captures a lot of the work that I do when we make public presentations. And Socrates' quote is, I'm not here to educate you, I'm here to make you think. And my job as an educator, because I spent many years in education before consulting, is my philosophy always was that I am here to make you think and make you think critically and not just to regurgitate facts. I'm not an instructor. I believe I'm an educator. An instructor just transfers knowledge. An educator, I hope, is one that makes you think. and think for yourself. And so it's one who challenges the premise of what you think now. Who needs to have accountability and ownership of the outcomes? This is the first issue. Often we find that we can blame anybody we want as long as we blame them well. And management accepts our passing the buck. We learned this in kindergarten, grade 1, when we didn't get our homework in. We fine-tuned it in high school, and we perfected it in university. And we continue this blame and excuse management right into the business world, when in reality, if I am accountable and responsible, if I own my commitments, therefore I own the fact that the commitments have not been made. So I think that one of the things that has to change in performance management is ownership. How do you create a performance management process that creates ownership, not by the manager, but by the employee? Too often, I think that, often it's kind of in parallel. When there's a good hire, the manager takes accountability for it. When there's a bad hire, they blame HR or the recruiter. I think that when there's good results, the individual takes accountability, responsibility for it. When bad results come in, we blame somebody else, and managers accept that excuse. And in reality, great excuses coupled with non-results equals acceptable performance. So dialogues, I think, are a different way of approaching this than conversations. The reason for that, I believe, is simple, that conversations can be one way. Conversations can be a sharing of a perspective or a sharing of a position. And then in conversations, we are like two ships at the night that pass each other because we're both sharing information, trying to justify our position or come up. Coaching is an issue because, in my opinion, and I've done a lot of work, and I hate sports analogies, but coaching is, if I'm a true coach and I realize the player cannot play the game well, and I want to be successful with my team winning, I fire the player and move them to another team. It doesn't mean they're not a good player. I mean, how many times have really great ball players failed on the first team or two that they were with? But when they get the right coach, the right environment, the right situation, they're very successful. So I'm not saying that they're not a good person. They're not a good person for your shop. So why are we, in coaching, it seems that corporate coaching falls short of the ability to pull the plug because coaching is an excuse for being a nice guy. And in reality, most coaching programs wind up being mentoring programs. And so there is, I believe, a difference in dialogue, because a dialogue is a flow of meaning between two people. People with different opinions and assumptions share their understanding, listen to one another. They understand the other person from the other person's perspective. These are all things that, unfortunately, I do not believe go into coaching. So in true dialogue, we enroll each other to drive commitment with one another. We gain clarity in understanding to move forward, and we realize that our needs are the needs of other people, and therefore we gain ownership. I'm going to skip this. I'll send this to anybody who wants this presentation. I'll gladly send it, but in the interest of time, I want to sort of move forward. When you have an exchange and a dialogue with your direct reports, the content, I believe, must be real. If not brutal, honest exchange, it's not going to be real. And if the person is really failing, they got to be told that they're failing and why, and what needs to be done in order to be seen as not failing. That they have to have meaningful feedback based on anecdotal evidence. And this is a problem since managers are not there. So the solution in dialogue is, to me, obvious. The dialogue needs to be initiated by the direct report. So, in my opinion, when this system works, and in the corporations where it's in place, it is reversed or it's turned to 180, and it says the person that's responsible for initiating the dialogue is the direct report, not the manager. When you've done the right behavior or need help in doing the right behavior, you need to bring it to your manager's attention So when, in fact, the manager does get somebody who complains after there's evidence that you've done it right, the manager can actually put it in perspective. There needs to be meaningful consequences, as I've mentioned. And therefore, holding someone accountable is really about asking questions. Managers have to learn how to ask questions and not have answers. So the elephant in the room, as I said, is compensation, and the other elephant in the room is behaviors. And the behavior part is really a problem because, just very quickly, I'm going to skip that cartoon. You can read it later. When are budgets set? Usually budgets are set before the final annual review is done, and in those budgets you already know how much money you have for your bonus and merit, but yet you play this game and you go through this game of saying, let's go through the review and then we'll fit that budget. We'll make the budget fit whatever we come up with. Where we got to come up with something that justifies the budget. It doesn't work that way. People begin to understand that. The authenticity of the dialogue has to mean, and this is something which, again, I can go on for a long time on, because this is an area that I've been working on for 30 years. The authenticity of the dialogue has to be based on behaviors that are authentic to the organization. What do I mean by that? Too many organizations have adopted or adapted competency models from, quote, best practices or best in class. If you remember in the beginning of this presentation, I said no two organizations are alike. No two organizations have the same meaning for the same values. And no two organizations have the same leadership style, which means the same behavior. So if there was a correct leadership style or a correct set of behaviors, there'd be one competency model in this world, and everybody would follow it, and everybody would be little automatons, 1984, and we'd all be acting the same way. Reality is that we're all different. Every organization is different. Every organization has a different set of needed behaviors. And we try to bring these behaviors in from, quote, best in practice, or values in from what another successful company is doing, and create what I call aspirational values. What you do is you confuse those who are successful in the organization, and you frustrate those because the roadmap of success has just changed. If you don't have a competency model that is based on the authentic behaviors, not the job descriptions, not the outcomes, but the behaviors that lead to the outcomes, the why behind the what, it's hard to have a conversation, a coaching moment, or a dialogue because it's not consistently clear what the organization expects. So one of the obstacles to putting in place this movement towards ending the annual review is having in place a behavioral competency model that is A, authentic to the organization, is based on what is truly successful in the organization, therefore authentic, and is unique to the organization because it differentiates why people in this organization are successful. Without that in place, creating this process that allows for dialogue, that allows for people to having an exchange of information from manager to direct report and direct report to manager becomes very difficult. Because right now, most organizations base their competency models on transferable validity and not content validity. Transferable validity is the consulting firm will tell you, we have worked with this hundreds of organizations around the world, and we know that this is the right definition of communication. Not true. The right definition of communication is the communication style that works in your organization. It can't be what works in another organization. There could be similarities, there could be overlap, but if you don't capture what truly differentiates communication in your organization, you have not done the dialogue process justice. And then the other approach is validity, content validity. Content validity simply means that we know over time, demonstrating these behaviors within our organization have led to success. There's one very prevalent years ago was work-life balance. And I always used to joke that if you were working in a hospital as an emergency room physician and you told them based on work-life balance, because it's in the profile, therefore I'm supposed to have it, I'm not coming in next Saturday because you promised me work-life balance, because the competency model is a promise of behavior, you're probably not going to work there as an emergency room physician very long. So why do we put behaviors as a message to employees, these are the right behaviors for success, when in fact they're going to lead to the wrong behaviors for success? So all I'm trying to say in this section is what in fact is success in an organization is something that is important. And let me just capture this, and then what I want to do is jump to the questions that you might have, and also some of the questions that have gone into that I've learned from these organizations over the years. You need to create your competency model based on the values of your organization and the vision. They become the foundation of correctness for everything else. If anything else is put in place in your organization that will not move you towards the vision or cause an employee not to live the values, the activity is inappropriate. It's a mixed message of confusion because it doesn't create alignment. It creates lack of alignment. Therefore, is the strategic plan moving us to the vision and causing us to live the values? If not, change the strategic plan. Don't change the vision, don't change the values. Each business unit's contribution is to the strategic plan. Therefore, each team and individual goals will give me, the individual employee, a line of sight that I'm contributing to something larger than myself. That's where we get engagement. That's where we get purpose. That's where we get meaning. That's where we generate what I call discretionary effort. What if all your employees had a clear line of sight? What if they all were energized and passionate about what they were doing? What if all feel they are the cause of the company's success? It will be because they have employees who are engaged, productive, retained, and find meaning in the work they do. Therefore, an organization can use performance management when it's set up right, eliminate your annual reviews clearly because they're not necessary, and give ongoing dialogue, which happens once a month. I'll talk about that in the next presentation. And the question is, if you demonstrate the behavior of respect all the time and without exception, can you exceed expectation? One of the other conundrums I find in these performance review systems when it comes to behavior, they have the idea of exceed expectations. The reason the behavior is stated in the profile is it's supposed to happen all the time. Therefore, from my perspective, you can't exceed expectations because you can't do it more than all the time. And what I'll talk about in the next presentation is going to be feed forward, because the whole premise of what happens in this concept of moving towards an elimination of the annual review is to take your eyes off the rearview mirror and develop an action plan based on last year's information instead of basing it on what people need for next year. So some final thoughts. And as I said, this list was compiled from a number of workshops and organizations that participated in the workshops on how to create annual reviews and move forward. And out of the workshops, I asked them, and if anybody wants this list, the full list, I'll gladly send it to them. So here's a partial list. Start feed forward-facing goals and development. Don't base things on what happened in the past. Base things on what feed forward, not feed backward, what is needed for the future. Teach managers and employees how to turn off self-talk. That's that voice in the back of the head that rationalizes and justifies everything before they meet with somebody. Set positive and negative consequences which are meaningful and motivational. Elimination of the rating scale. Creating meaning of the work and objectives that they contribute to something larger than themselves. Have authentic behavioral competencies in place. How to measure an intangible has to be taught to both reports and direct reports, managers and direct reports. Because the behavior isn't intangible, it's something unlike a business result, it's harder to measure. Establish ownership and accountability through dialogue. Conduct focus groups with employees before you begin any changes. Senior management, in particular your executives, have to have a mindset of being talent champions. In other words, they need to realize that the legacy they leave is not about improving just the organization's performance, but the people who contribute to that. They need to be talent champions in the real meaning of the word. Training on dialogues for both managers and contributors has to be in place before the system starts. Having a dedicated person to ensure consistency in the execution of the process. It is not an HR process, by the way. Cannot be seen as an HR process. Transparency in the process that is behind the curtain. In other words, many organizations, and I'll talk about this in a future session, many organizations have a shadow rating system upon which the bonus and merit are given out. And when that happens, the transparency is negated and people become cynical again. Regular feedback on behaviors and values has to happen on not on a yearly basis, not twice a year, not a 3 times a year, but you have to have these moments of truth with employees on a regular basis when needed. And if you have any questions as a result of this workshop, you can either call me at this number or you can email me. I will gladly share with everybody who's participated other people's questions so that we can share and grow the learning. For more information on the authenticity of corporate values and the authenticity of what are real behaviors in organizations, you can read my book. It's available as an ebook or as a hard copy book on Amazon on Inside the Box. And Inside the Box is not a mistake. It is there because when it comes to values, you just can't think outside the box. You've got to live within the organization's values and in the organization's construct. So that is my comments for the day.